Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the eMarketing Association. My day job is I run Did It, an 83-person digital first ad agency, and I have a nonprofit called Giving Forward that does cause marketing to generate money for nonprofits. I'm joined today by Dan Rosensweig, one of the founders of Kettle Space, which originated as sort of the conversion of restaurants and pubs during the day into co-working spaces. I actually used it in an interim between offices for probably a month and a half, 2 months. So that was my exposure to Kettle Space. But you've continued to evolve the company since then. So I'd love to hear the full backstory and your latest sort of addition to the core functionality.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. It's always fun. As a person who likes to talk, it's always fun to talk. So thanks for bringing me on. And secondly, thank you for for patronizing us. Always love to hear. You're never going to get better feedback or more candid feedback than an actual user. So maybe I can get some feedback on an aside, but I appreciate the look nonetheless. So we're absolutely you nailed it on the head as where we started, and maybe I'll just sort of talk a little bit about my background, sort of how Kettlespace got started, and then talk a little bit about the pivot. I'll do so quickly. So I was employee 241 on the real estate team at WeWork. So 241 in the entire company. The real estate team tended to be the smallest company. I was the third hire on the real estate team. This was in early 2015. And my job at WeWork was to underwrite their global portfolio, and then over time started doing deal execution and site selection here domestically. So focused on the West Coast and Texas. And I think since leaving in 2016, there's a lot of information you can read about the company. There was a great idea that execution sometimes wasn't perfect, and for those reasons, you can sort of do your own research. But I was on that team until early 2016 when I left to start Kettle Space. And the idea with Kettle Space was to say, hey, I like what WeWork was doing in terms of creating community and tapping in to creating wonderful workspaces for employees that are convenient for them and conducive to productive work, that are more fun and engaging than being in your typical cubicle office. But at the same time, I wasn't necessarily down with raising billions of dollars and creating significant liabilities against short-term revenue streams. So the idea with Kettlespace was, how can we deliver as much of the upside as we possibly can by creating warm, local, welcoming environments that are also affordable for our members to access? And the way we found to do that without having to raise god awful amounts of money was to partner with restaurants that were underutilized during the day. So in Manhattan, the restaurant industry makes most of its money on food and beverage sales, which is pretty typical, and people tend to drink those now more than ever in the evenings. So there are a lot of high-end restaurants that actually don't serve breakfast or lunch, and they open at 5 p.m. And so sort of my real estate spidey sense started tingling while I was at WeWork and seeing this opportunity, saying, hey, these environments are great. They're paying rent 24 hours a day, and they're only monetizing it some small percentage of that. Why not create an additional revenue stream for them? So that's where Kettlespace came from. We started in September 2016 is when we opened our first location. By March 2020, we were operating 22 locations simultaneously in Manhattan and Brooklyn on a daily basis. And we were serving around 3,000 members who were paying monthly fees to get access to that network. So obviously you can see where this goes. March 2020 happens. The pandemic ticks up. And, being in the co-working business, which, there were a lot of haves and have-nots in the pandemic. And hospitality and co-working was unfortunately one of the have-nots. Because it required you to physically leave your home and crowd around other people. So we tried to do what we thought was the right thing. And part of being asset light is we didn't have significant liabilities that forced us to make questionable decisions. So we turned to our members and said, you can't access this. We're going to pause everyone's membership. We're not going to charge anyone a dime, and stay safe. We'll see you on the other side. And the truth is, we said the same thing to our host partners, who were made up of restaurants and hotels, and said, we wish everyone the best of luck, but we don't have a business to operate right now, so we'll see you on the other side. So that's sort of where the story starts, per what you were saying, which is we had to make some change, right? We went from more than $1 million in revenue to zero overnight. And I still had a staff of 25. And how were we going to, keep folks employed, right? These are the less sexy, less fun parts of being a leader and a founder is how to support folks in tougher times. And so we ended up through different channels hooking up with NYU. And NYU approached us and said, we've seen your spaces, which, operate in and around our campus. And we want to bring as many students back this fall, flashback 1 year, this was the summer of 2020, as we possibly can. Because schools, as they realized, a lot of the core value in being a student is not just taking the classes, but in the college experience and being around and socializing and getting out of the house and really, being a co-ed as some might say. And so their goal was to bring as many people to campus as they possibly could. And just for reference, NYU is the third largest private real estate owner in the city. So behind two Catholic church entities. So really large owner. They own hundreds of buildings in the Midtown South area, sort of around, let's call it Bleecker Street, or Washington Square Park as sort of the center of campus. And with 6-foot distancing, they didn't have enough space in their portfolio to facilitate classes and study space and dining. So they came to us and said, hey, we know you guys are very flexible when it comes to creating environments. Can you create 500 COVID safe seats for our students to study? But they had very strict geographic limitations for where it had to be a 10-minute walk from Washington Square Park. And the caveat there is they actually own most of the buildings within that vicinity. So really had to thread the needle with this one. We were able to put it together. So we, across 5 restaurants and 1 hotel, we cobbled together 500 seats across 30,000 square feet that we made available to NYU students in the fall of 2020. In addition, and this is sort of where the software stuff comes in, they needed a booking tool that made it easy for students to know that when they arrived at the location that the seat that they were hoping to study in would be available. In a prior iteration, Kevin, when you and I maybe went to school as undergrads, when we needed to go study, I kind of knew where I wanted to go, but I would wander around the library and find an open Carrel and I'd sit down and do my work. But during COVID, that wasn't necessarily viewed as a safe activity, right? And on the flip side of that, we also have Gen Z, who's really used to doing everything at their fingertips, right? So a booking app made sense. So what we did was we took our consumer app and we reskinned it and made it available to NYU. And we added some features that over time grew to us having, I think last year was close to 45,000 daily active users across 150 buildings. And I think it was like 7,000 or 8,000 seats. And what it took was people, space, and time, and it sort of mixed them all together in an easy to use consumer-based fashion. It synced with the NYU health app so that it made sure that you had tested negative in order to make a booking. But once that was verified, you were able to reserve space either in one of our spaces in one of the restaurants or in NYU's campus-owned space, at your own leisure. And so I'll sort of take a quick break there, but that's where the software started. And I would say, I was just talking to someone about this. I think pre-pandemic, we were an operations company, right? Primarily because co-working is an ops heavy business, with software capabilities. And I would say now we're in a position where we're really a software company with operations capabilities. And I think that would be the major catalyst being COVID forcing us to sort of shift how we did business.
So I guess the question I'd have is, obviously large employers are also struggling with the space utilization issue, different from NYU's, right. But typically, they've already got an existing lease, right? Maybe they're using it differently now than they had been previously, depending on where they are or where the city is or the location is with regards to that pandemic curve and whether social distancing is recommended or not. The number of square feet that an employee occupies could really vary right now, So do you see a lot of them also simultaneously moving from sort of the fixed cubicle mindset to this more nomadic flex space where they would want to essentially allow you to book a flex space within a corporate environment, the same way that you booked flex space for the student who has their tablet or their laptop with them, and sort of it's like their entire life is in their backpack, right?
That's exactly right. And so the short answer is yes. We believe that flexibility is going to become more of an asset that companies can use to attract talent and sort of maintain it, right? You don't necessarily have to take a, I don't want to call it Draconian, but you doesn't have to have a one size fits all mentality for however everything occurs, right? There are unique use cases that can be built around. But the short answer is we actually this week are launching, and we're piloting with several companies, what we're calling Kettle OS. And what it is it's software that's built for companies who have existing office space, right? But it might not be like software enabled at that point. So people might, for example, everyone has a dedicated desk, right? It might be in a cubicle. It might be in sort of what they call trading floor style desks, which have become more common of late, right? Prior to COVID, which are what you think of as open floor plan, right? It's dense desk-based seating where you can just pop down and do your work, right? So from a density standpoint, right? Historically speaking, I would say in the 80s, it was closer to 250 square feet per employee, right? It got down in the early 2010s or late 2010s down to closer to, call it, at the lowest, it was 75, but in WeWork, it was like 50. Most organizations were probably around 100 and 125, right? A lot of folks, I talk about this stuff all the time. They think that's going to tick back up a little bit to create a little bit more distance between people, right? So maybe it goes up to 125, 150, just to create a slightly larger barrier on a per employee basis. But the environment that people are going to consume at the office is going to be much more focused on collaboration and teamwork, right? And team building than it will be for heads down work, right? Which the assumption is heads down work can be done in many different environments, some of which are your home, right? And so the main utility of the office has sort of shifted from the place where everything gets done to this is the place to connect. It's the place to brainstorm, have in-person meetings and build culture, right? As they say. And then the rest can kind of be done on your own time or in any location that you see fit, right? And so a lot of companies, what we're seeing is are taking the 3x2, which is 3 days in the office, 2 days not, and they're sort of delegating it down to the team leads to decide which days that their team is going to be in the office and which days they're not. So all in all, what it is actually going to do is allow one space to meet the needs of what the people want, as opposed to being this like, we've always done it this way, so we're always going to do it this way kind of view, right? And then the next, and doing that, it should allow you to be smarter about your real estate overall, right? And make sure your space truly is working for what your people want. And I think what you might find is that you might not need quite as much space as you think, especially if people are going to be out of the office anywhere from 20 to 40% of the time.
Right.
And so the idea of, right, to throw the software in there again, what it really does is it does two things. First off, it does vaccine verification, right? So I think with the Delta variant, spiking up, what people want to know is if I'm going to be inside in an environment, I want to know that other people are vaccinated around me. Second, right, mask policy. So mask policy can be determined by the organization themselves. Hospitality generally leads it because it's more heavily regulated than office, but recently they've been saying, they want folks inside to be wearing masks when they're not, right? If you're not at a specific location or eating, you kind of should be wearing your mask, right? It's more just to prevent the spread, which I think makes a decent amount of sense. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the organization to figure out for themselves. And then finally, I think most importantly, in allowing individuals to reserve space when it makes sense for them. So if in the previous model we had our own desk, right, and I had a little lock cabinet and I had a photo of my dog on my desk, that might not need to be the case anymore, right? Because I've got everything I need between my phone and my laptop for the most part, right? For most business services workers, that's the case. And I can kind of sit in any seat. And so in that way, instead of allocating a specific seat just to me, if I'm only going to be in the office some percentage of the time, then allowing me to kind of come into any seat and reserve it before I get there probably makes more sense. And it's going to allow the company to sort of shrink their footprint over time, which I think will save the money, which at the end of the day is kind of the name of the game. So that's Kettle OS in a nutshell.
Do you think that there'll be the possibility of either a locker or a rolling some
Sure.
kind of local storage unit that rolls
Completely.
in and out?
I think all that makes sense, right? Like whether it's a locker, we all think of like locker rooms, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be like that, right? It could be one of those rolling things. Like honestly, right? I don't necessarily need anything, so it's got to be something that like you absolutely need. Maybe it's screens, right? There are things that you could need, but they're also like, do the screens necessarily have to be my same two screens I see every day, or could I plug into screens that are already there that work for me, right? Maybe if there was a medical, like I'm sure you could think of, there are many reasons that people would specifically need to store something on site, and that's totally fine. That can be accommodated. But to make that the rule as opposed to the exception is costing companies money. And I think isn't necessarily delivering like the value that to employees that they might think it does. I think it's more of, we've always done it this way and I don't want to think too hard about it, so we'll just let it be. So.
Yeah, I think certainly real estate is especially in New York City and certain other cities, the cost per square foot for B or A rate buildings. We're talking about a pretty significant operation.
Higher, right? Like even Class C is higher in New York than some Class A stuff in other markets, right? It really is market specific. So in a city like New York with some of the highest commercial prices, at least domestically, right? Like there are other cities like that. London, very expensive, right? Et cetera. There are more expensive cities. We acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean just because we're not the most expensive in the world doesn't mean we shouldn't be smart about how we're spending, right? For our investors and for our employees, right? Like every dollar we're spending on real estate, in theory, could go back into R&D, could go into employee salaries, right? Or could be, I don't know, saved or something, right? Like it doesn't have to just go as a subsidy to large commercial owners. Who have benefited from a slow expansion over time. So I think this is it's a good time for us to sort of audit everything we're doing, right? Not just real estate. Like I think in my own personal life, we're auditing like why we're doing certain things and sort of making changes. That's what we call growth. And I think by applying just a little bit of thought and doing a little bit of hard work up front, we can set ourselves up for serious success long term. And I may have said this before. I've said it a couple times today, so I apologize. It's all starting to mesh together. But it's I think the simple paradigm of like what gets measured gets managed, right? And I think for us, you don't have to change anything about how your offices do anything at all. But if you're just tracking how it's being used, that's the only change you need. You can at least set yourself up to make changes in the future based on data, right? As opposed to whims. And a lot of the decisions companies have historically made are based on gut feel as opposed to data. And I think it's 2021. It's time to step it up.
Well, you guys are starting to roll out at least cautiously, but with momentum, your physical spaces again. Obviously there will come a time where you'll be doing that sort of ops for the flexible use spaces as opposed to, being in the software business.
Completely.
So I'm sort of curious, had you pre-pandemic gotten a sense, because I always thought that the way your offering was constructed, it would really be great for what I would call nomadic workers, in particular in sales, right? Who might be in different parts of the city with meetings with different people, and probably had three appointments a day scheduled, and the proximity of a Kettle Space to two of those three was going to be a huge godsend for them, because there was no way they were going to get a seat in the Starbucks or get any work done in a Starbucks. But there weren't a lot of other choices that had a decent footprint. Obviously, your footprint may be slightly smaller during your relaunch.
Yeah.
But had you found that was sort of your primary customer, or did people really come back to the same space every day the way they would in an office?
So, great question. So it really varied. I would say 50% of people went to the same space, right? It was convenient to where they lived, and they'd go back, and they were, regulars, and they were like best friends with the community managers, and they built strong. It was wonderful, right? And then the other 50% were a bit more nomadic, right? They might be commuting in from outside the city, facilitating in-person meetings. We had a lot of folks who were pharmaceutical reps, who were food and beverage sales folks, right? And you can always tell because they're dragging a backpack, which probably has wine or champagne or something, some fun new product in there, as they're building relationships with restaurants around the world. There were any number of roles around that. What we found, they were primarily smaller teams and individuals, for the most part. I think the largest change of what we're seeing now, at least, is that enterprise, larger companies, considering flexibility, like flex work or co-working, and whatever moniker you want to use, is now more viable, right? And I think that's the biggest macro trend, because if we kind of flash back a year, or maybe not go all the way back, but if we audit the last year, you're like, most companies actually performed pretty well. Maybe just look at like equities and ignore all the, just look at the sales, right? More than anything, right? They actually did super well, right? And so if you had tried to talk to the head of facilities before the pandemic and said, like, all right, imagine for a second, no one can come into the office on Monday, right? Like, in literally like a 9/11 style scenario. I hate to bring it up, but like that's how black swan this thing was. How are you guys going to do? They probably would have very easily said, like, we're probably going to be down, right? There's probably going to be some issues, some supply chain stuff, like whatever. And supply chain stuff, yes, there were issues, but for the most part, productivity was the same and sales were really strong. So that's why when you see, I think the best example of looking at that is now with Delta coming up, if you read the news, like a lot of large companies, Google, Facebook, JP Morgan, everyone, they're all pushing their return to work back. But what you don't see in that conversation is people predicting dire results of that, right? Like they're not, why? Because they're not that correlated, to be honest, right? People proved that, one, that they're incredibly resilient, right? And two, they don't have to be in the office, physically in the office, in order to do a really good job and keep orders moving, keep customers happy, keep the top line moving up. So, I think listen, in my heart of hearts, what really drives the return to space more than anything is the fact that people have sunk, like, they're not, I guess they don't consider them sunk costs, but they have significant liabilities, right? It tends to be real estate tends to be the largest fixed asset on their balance sheet. And if they've got 2 or 3 years left on that lease, they want to get some value out of it. And the only way to really do that is to bring people back or sublease it. And so they don't want to sublease. They'd rather bring folks back and talk about culture. And yes, there's some validity to it. But as soon as health and safety comes up, culture, it's going to take a back seat and people are going to, stay home a little bit longer. So for us, Delta, obviously the micro is terrible. There's no question about it. And we wish everyone the utmost safety. And all we can do is, one, with our software, make it as safe as possible for people to get back into the office. And then over time, track and understand how space is being used. And then in the future, make smarter real estate decisions. And if you don't have an existing office, right, I don't know that you're rushing to go create a new one, right? I do talk to some people but for the most part, a lot of companies are just okay being remote. And for them, they're more focused on how can I set my individual employees up for success? And then we'll bring folks together, maybe once a quarter, maybe once a year, depending on the type of organization, to do in-person stuff. We'll do team building stuff. We'll get drinks and dinner. And then we'll do brainstorming. So like, you really can have your cake and eat it too here. But you really just got to be open-minded about it. So what I would say is, if you've got existing office, we can help. And if you don't, we can help you too.
Great. Well, I look forward to watching the evolution as you both increase your footprint for the nomads who want to utilize those spaces that are underutilized during the day, and also, watch you innovate within the utilization of existing corporate spaces. It's pretty cool.
Well, thanks so much. We'll try our best, and if we don't figure it out today, we'll keep trying on the another day. That's all we can do.
Great. Thanks so much for joining me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kevin.